I'm a frequent lurker of this sub, and figured I'd never have anything to contribute. However, having had to call the police tonight, I remembered an unsettling series of events that occurred around 14 years ago, when I was in the 8th grade. I grew up in the rural South, next door to my grandparents. We lived in a deeply wooded area right off the highway, on a large plot of land my grandparents owned. When this took place, only my grandmother was alive. While not huge, our woods were large enough to act as a home for deer, rabbits, foxes, and the like. Just to give you a sense of how in the boonies this was, at the edge of our land was a family-owned dairy farm and fields along the highway. Google Maps still can't locate my childhood address. Near the end of the 8th grade, our class went on a day-to-day field trip, and parents were to pick us up at 10 p.m. This being before the cell phone boom, I was pretty embarrassed and upset when no one came to get me from school. We tried calling the house phone, but that was a no-go. About an hour late, my dad finally came to get me in his pickup, calm but visibly rattled. As it turned out, as my dad was leaving to get me on time, 4 strange men were lurking through our large wooded yard. Burly redneck as he is, my dad chased them through the woods until they disappeared into the field, our tiny pug giving chase right along with him. The police were called, but there wasn't much they could do aside from filing a report. While scary, I was kind of an oblivious child, and with the police having been called, I figured it was over with. Addicts would sometimes steal lawnmowers and weed eaters. It happens. Looking back, the things that happened over the following months make my skin crawl. I began to notice strange cars parked off the highway near our home in the middle of the night. Given that our house was tucked back into the woods, it was easy for them to keep the license plate turned away from the view of our windows. And the cars were always just sitting, no one getting in or out, nothing whatsoever to even feign a breakdown. We called the police when we noticed these strange cars, but the distance to our home made it so that they had always driven off by the time anyone reached us. I didn't understand this at the time, but we were clearly being watched. Even as an adult, I don't understand what these people wanted. We lived in a little trailer that didn't exactly scream drug money awaits, and there were equally isolated yet affluent neighborhoods that were easily accessible. My parents worked full-time during the day, and my sister and I were both teenagers in school, so why not break in during the day? As I said, our home was wooded, shielded off a dirt road from the highway we lived on, so no one would have even noticed. I was in bed when the men came back. It seemed the strange car visits had lessened, but my father went out late one evening to get CDs from his pickup, and they were out there again. My mother made us stay inside when she called the police, but I remember the sound of my father screaming as he thundered after them. Just like last time, they disappeared into the woods. The police couldn't find them. They agreed that they were stalking us out. We were poor, so there was no money for security equipment. My mother had never allowed guns in the house until this point, but my grandfather's old rifles were now being kept in their closet. While we lived in our trailer, our grandmother lived beside us in a little brick house she had built with my grandfather in the 70s. It had an old-fashioned carport with steps that led over to our front door, clunky with frosted glass shutters from top to bottom. It made a distinct heavy sound of shaking glass when it was knocked on. Usually a family member would sleep over with her in case she needed something, but she had been feeling well that day and didn't need help. She always stayed up late watching television and liked to sleep during the day when it was sunny and warm. A man came to her door, sometime past 3 in the morning. She called out to ask who it was, thinking it might be one of us, but there was no answer. He continued to knock while my grandmother told him to go away, to leave her alone. Instead, he opened her door. It was old and fairly easy to unlock, but her chain lock kept him from getting in. so he spoke directly to her through the crack. He would only tell her, "Come on, let me in. Let me in. I know you're alone." I have no idea how she kept her calm through this, or how she had the nerve to lie on her couch and get equally irate with the strange man at her door in the middle of the night. She couldn't walk well, and her phone was in the kitchen. After 15 minutes of this exchange, the stranger calmly closed the door and just walked away. My grandmother called our home first. He could be coming to us next. And then she called the police. I was sitting in my grandfather's recliner, listening as she told the officers what had happened. She was calm then too, with her jaw stuck out in anger. Obviously nothing ever came of it. We never found out who was watching us, or why they were doing it, and the man never came back again. The strangers in their unfamiliar cars just stopped coming, and we never saw anyone outside again. So for the context of this story, this was about 10 years ago, so I don't remember it completely. Forgive me if I kind of use filler content here and there, or if the details seem a bit skewed. I was about 13 the first time my parents took me and my little brother to Disneyland for the first time, and it was literally the happiest place on earth. Me and my brother, who was only 10 at the time, adored the rides, the fireworks, the food, just the magic of the atmosphere in general. It was my favorite family vacation we had ever taken. However, I seemed to get a lot of negative attention. I was tall for my age, and already well developed, so I would get stares from older men. I didn't realize it at the time, but I overheard my dad mention something to my mom about a father with his own 2 children staring at my ass in the line of a ride. This barely concerned me though, considering where we were at. On the 3rd day of our vacation, my parents were so worn out they didn't want to go to the park anymore. I begged and pleaded with them to allow me and my brother to head off on our own, and finally, my mother talked my father into allowing us to go and explore Disneyland by ourselves. Taking my brother firmly by the hand, we walked to the park entrance and experienced a newfound sense of glorious freedom as we walked through the gate by ourselves for the first time. It was almost like seeing it all over again, only in a new light. Like I said, I was completely oblivious to most things, since I had grown up in a small town in relative safety. I was a nerd, and nobody ever paid attention to me at my middle school, so I didn't expect them to pay attention to me anywhere else. I remember getting in line for Pirates of the Caribbean, and I felt someone else get in line behind me and my brother. He was standing very, very close enough to almost be touching my brother. Since my brother has autism, and I didn't want him freaking out because someone was so close, I decided to play the sacrificial lamb and stepped in between him and my brother. However, this just made the man step even closer, practically pressing up against my body. I felt uncomfortable, but I chose to ignore him as we got closer to the front of the ride. Stepping into the boat, I stuck my baby brother on the side and slunk into the middle seat. From behind me, I could hear a commotion, and someone slid in next to me, and the creepy guy who kept pressing up against me. It didn't take him long to continue getting in my personal space, his hand practically touching my upper thigh. I was a shy 13-year-old, and this was a grown-ass man. How the hell was I going to try and keep him off me? He would have crushed me like a bug, so I tried to huddle next to my brother and enjoy the ride. As it went on, the guy's hand went from a relaxed stance to a firm grip, his thumb digging into my skin. I wanted to cry and vomit all at the same time, as my oblivious brother watched the animatronic pirates. As the ride was getting to a standstill, the guy finally turns to me and gives me a smile. At least I think it was. It was on a super dark part of the ride, and it could have been a snarl for all I knew. He mentioned something about seeing me and my brother around the park, that we looked like we were lost, and that he could give us behind-the-scenes tour of the park since he was an off-duty park employee. He said he worked over at Tower of Terror in California Adventure. I politely declined, and the guy finally let go of my thigh but kept his legs securely glued to my own. I couldn't get out of that damn boat fast enough. Heart in my throat, and my brother in tow, we got out of the ride and burst onto the busy street. I didn't know what to do except get away from the creep, but he tailed me and my brother for another 10 minutes. Finally, I realized what my 13-year-old terrified self had to do. I marched up to the closest park employee, a young short woman with blonde hair, and started telling her about the events of the last half hour. I tried to point out the man, but apparently as soon as he saw that we were going to talk to staff, he hightailed it out of there. She reassured me that they would do everything in their power to try and find the guy, but she couldn't make any promises. We were asked to go to security and not walk back to our hotel alone so I could give a description of the man. Unfortunately, I was unable to because of the dimness of the ride. They called our parents, who were visibly shaken, but were just glad we were okay. The rest of our vacation went off without a hitch, but my brother and I were kept by our parents' sides the entire time. Even when we went back and I was 16, my mother kept me glued to her hip the entire time. It was only when we went back and I was 19 that she allowed me and my brother to wander off again. But by this point, I was my loud-mouthed, sweary self you see before you. I guess these sorts of occurrences aren't uncommon in the park, unfortunately. And for the sake of those who are victims of something like this, I pray that you speak up, scream, fight, and do whatever you can to get away from people like that man. This takes place last spring, almost exactly 1 year ago. At the time, my parents and I lived in a somewhat solitary life out in the countryside. Other than bad cell phone and internet reception, there were other homes in the area, but not many, and exclusively consisted of retirees and wealthy families. My parents, who are wealthy and retired, were planning a trip to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. They wanted to sightsee and visit my mom's ill mother. I've been to Gettysburg before on a class field trip, and decided not to go. I had schoolwork and projects to work on that were due that Friday, and going to Gettysburg for a second time didn't seem all that interesting to me. My parents do a lot of traveling and volunteer work, and over the years placed a lot of trust in me, so they had no issues with me being alone for several days, or even a week at a time by the time I reached 16 years old and obtained my driver's license. Anyway, I got up in the morning of their departure, and by the time I left for school, my parents were preparing to leave. When I got home that afternoon, they were already gone, so I had 3 days to myself. I spent the first afternoon and evening doing homework and gaming. That evening, I decided to drive out to the closest town and pick up a pizza for myself, since I didn't feel like preparing anything. When I got home, I ate about half the pizza, and after watching some YouTube, decided to turn in for the night. I awoke sometime around midnight, which isn't out of the ordinary for me as I sometimes have trouble sleeping late at night. I went downstairs for a glass of orange juice, and decided to flip through the channels on our living room television. I was sitting there, looking at my phone more than watching the television, when I saw a light turn on through one of the living room windows. It was our garage's motion sensor light. Did my parents come home much earlier than expected? I sat quietly and waited. The light eventually turned off, but I didn't hear any noise. I thought that it must have been an animal or something, perhaps a deer. I turned off the television and went upstairs into my bedroom and lied in bed. I fell asleep not long afterwards. I awoke to the sound of my alarm, and it was time to get ready for school. I arose, got ready, and headed out the door into my car and drove off to school. I got home that afternoon and spent the day similarly to before. I did homework, gamed, ate dinner, and went to bed. I slept through the night that night, and awoke the next day and headed off to school again. My mom called me during that school day and left a message saying that her and my dad were going to stay longer than expected, as my grandmother was in pretty rough shape. I got home and once again did the same routine, except this time I finished up my senior project and was almost officially finished with high school. I relaxed that evening outside on our hammock and read a book until sunset, debating whether or not to travel to Gettysburg the next day to visit my grandmother. Dinner time came and went, and I decided to settle on the couch and continue reading my book. Since it was Friday, I had no school the next day, and stayed up later than usual. It was about 11 o'clock at night when I looked at my phone and noted the time. I left my bedroom and across our foyer to use the bathroom sometime that night, when I noticed that through one of our front door windows, the garage light was on again. That's odd. I peered outside towards the light and saw my car but nothing else. The light turned off and I went to use the bathroom. I decided to grab a snack afterwards, so I went into the kitchen after using the bathroom and made a sandwich. Out of nowhere, I heard a faint tapping noise coming from one of our morning room windows. I felt on edge as I looked towards the tapping and saw nothing but the blinds over the windows. Having never dealt with something like this before, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't have been hearing things, could I? I definitely didn't imagine the motion sensor light being on. I wanted to call my mom and dad, but they were most likely sleeping by now. I waited and listened to see if I could hear anything else. Nothing. I went upstairs into my parents' bedroom and found my dad's handgun in his dresser drawer. I sat in my bedroom and looked out my window towards the backyard. I watched for what felt like 10 minutes or so, hoping that whoever or whatever it was would just go away. I eventually went back downstairs, and to my horror, I heard the tapping noise again, except now it was coming from one of the front door windows. The garage sensor light was on, but when I looked towards the window I saw nobody yet again. I thought that maybe a friend of mine was playing a prank on me. I have a couple of good friends who know that I'm home alone, but they'd never done anything like this before. I texted all of them, and only got one reply. The friend denied being at my house, and told me that he was lying in bed trying to sleep. I waited and waited until I could hear another noise, but about half an hour went by without further incident. I didn't see the garage light come on again, nor did I hear any other noises for the rest of the night. I turned in for the night after checking the locks on our doors and windows. I awoke the next morning and went downstairs to have breakfast. Afterwards, I vividly remembered the previous night's events and went outside to look around the house to see if anything was out of place. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. Our patio was untouched, none of our stuff had been moved or taken, and our shed hadn't been tampered with. Even our shed, which was unlocked, didn't seem to have been messed with. I looked inside of it and didn't notice anything missing. I went back inside and decided to sleep for a while longer. I awoke that afternoon at 2:30. I called my mom and told her about what had happened, and she told me to keep my dad's gun with me and call the police if I saw anyone or heard the tapping again. She also told me she would be home the next evening. I went on a drive later that afternoon and stopped by my friend's house for a while before heading home. I came home later than expected, and after eating dinner, I sat down on the couch and decided to relax. I was dozing off when I heard the sound of someone walking on our patio. I swiftly made my way towards the back door and waited, listening for any more noises. Then I had an idea. I quietly ran towards the front door and peered towards the garage to see if this person would walk towards it and turn the motion sensor light on again. Then I could see if I knew the person and could see the face. Luckily, exactly that happened. I was looking towards the garage when the light came on. I saw the person light up in the night. It wasn't anybody that I recognized. At first I couldn't tell if it was a male or female given their long hair that covered half their face, and their attire wasn't noticeable. What I could tell, though, was that this person was armed and carrying a knife. I had to call the police now. I may have had a gun, but I was way too afraid to confront this creepy-looking person on my own, especially since I was probably not going to have the guts to actually shoot them. Suddenly, we made eye contact. I felt my heart drop. I saw a smirk form across the person's face as they walked towards the front door towards me. I jumped up and ran away towards the kitchen and called 911. After being redirected to the state police barracks, I told the dispatcher that an armed man or woman with some sort of dagger was creeping around my house. I stayed on the phone with them as I heard the person tapping on the front door, presumably with their weapon. Unfortunately, the closest officer was about half an hour away from me, so I had to fend for myself until then. I tried my best to describe the person to the dispatcher, but I simply couldn't. I told her about the motion light coming on the first night, the tapping noises, and the sound of someone walking on my patio. She asked if they had tried to force entry, but I said no, which was equally baffling to the two of us. I jumped suddenly when I heard the tapping coming from behind me. I heard a deep, muffled laugh coming from outside. At least now I knew it was a man. I looked at my phone after not hearing the dispatcher for a few moments, only to notice that the call had dropped. Damn reception out here in the middle of nowhere. I felt genuinely afraid at this point, so I ran up to the upper part of my foyer and lied down on the carpet. I focused my attention on both halves of my house, the front door and back door, gun in my hand and phone in the other. I didn't have to recall the barracks, given the dispatcher had already called me back by the time I had settled down on the ground in the foyer. My phone signal was weak, so I wasn't sure how much longer I would be able to stay on the line. As I waited, I heard the occasional tapping noise on my windows and doors. Then I heard for the first time the sound of my back door being tapped. I talked to the dispatcher, who was doing her best job to keep me calm as I sat there scared like a little mouse hiding from a cat. I felt scared as a motherfucker, even with a gun in my hand. After about 15 minutes, and losing connection with the dispatcher again, the sounds finally ceased. I went into the master bedroom and looked out the window towards the road. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity when I finally saw a car driving up towards my house. I ran downstairs and went in the front door and watched as the squad car pulled up. As I watched, 2 cops came out, one coming up to the door as the other walked around the house. I opened the door and greeted the female officer who came inside. We stood there in my foyer as I explained the previous night's events leading up to tonight. I also gave my description of the person. She made notes about everything while the male officer was walking around my house. After a few more questions, he told me they'll drive around the area a couple of times and recommended that my parents install a security system when they return. I still felt nervous after they left, especially because the male officer was unable to find any trace of the person who was fucking with me. Hopefully this potential burglar or whatever they were is now aware that this wasn't a house to be messed with. When my parents returned the next day, I filled them in on what had occurred during their trip. It wasn't until about a month later when my parents finally had a wireless security system installed in our home. Luckily, nothing major happened during that month, even during the times when I was home alone. However, the story doesn't end here. Unfortunately, there was another smaller incident that occurred. This time I wasn't home, but both of my parents were. I was away from home for a couple of days on a fishing and camping trip with 2 friends from school, when my mom called me telling me that they suspected that somebody had been trespassing on our property. My dad had gone outside to investigate after noticing our garage light came on several times over the span of about an hour. Of course, he found nobody, but he did notice that some of our patio chairs had been moved ever so slightly. I came home and never felt truly comfortable at night, even in my locked, secured house. Sometimes at night my mind plays tricks on me, and I imagine hearing the same tapping noises that I heard previously. Of course, I don't believe anyone's there, but I can't shake the feeling. Even a year later, I still sometimes feel like someone is outside my house when I'm awake at night. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here, as always. I just wanted to thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you guys enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave feedback in the comments below, as well as perhaps like, share, or subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have a personal story that you'd like to submit, or you'd like to just send me a message, links to all of my social media will be in the description for the video below. This includes my Gmail, Twitter, and Facebook accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the theme of the story is, if it has any, the name of the story, and how you would like to be credited in the description of the video the story appears in. If you're curious at all about the music used in this video, the music is always listed in the description below, in the order which it appears. I also have links to the artists and list the tracks by name, just in case you want to find more of their work. Last but not least, if you have any criticism, please be sure to leave it in the comments below, as I'm always looking for new ways to improve the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.